Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 268 through 270, which will cover manga chapters 381 through 384. And Luffy's finally broken through and made it to the last tower before the Tower of Justice, but the others still need to work their way through before they can catch up to him. Now for the synopsis. With the support of the Galila Company and Frankie family, the Straw Hats continue to make their way towards the Tower of Justice to catch up with Luffy, who has now made it just in front of the gate, only to be confronted by Blueno. Meanwhile, Sogeking has been accidentally left behind and has to figure out how he'll catch up to the group. Alright, so differences. Again, there are quite a few differences in these episodes as they're definitely trying to sort of create some distance between the anime and the manga, so there are a lot of extra scenes or a lot of drawn out stuff. But anyways, so obviously picking up from the last episode's filler cliffhanger, we have to obviously come back and reconcile that. So the whole beginning of the scene of episode 268 is added filler to resolve that, where Luffy is trapped on a cliff, which is actually a pretty funny scene, so I don't necessarily mind it. The scene of Sodom and Gomorrah rampaging through the main street of Enies Lobby after the CP9 scene, as well as most of the stuff including Luffy running around avoiding the Marines in episode 268 is added filler. However, that scene with Chopper learning about Sodom and Gomorrah's relationship with Frankie family and also sort of how they met is all canon material from the manga. However, this has been moved a bit in terms of sequencing, as this moment in the manga doesn't happen until after Luffy runs into Blueno in the manga. And this entire sort of stretch of material and scenes is rearranged quite a bit from the manga. And so I'm not really necessarily going to go over a lot of it, but basically the latter half of episode 269 and most of 270, the events play out pretty much the same. However, they're just kind of shuffled around a little bit. And so you see moments happen before or after that they're ordered in the manga. Another added moment in the anime that I kind of like that they added is the scene where Chopper is freaking out after Zoro's speech about Usopp saying, what are you talking about? Sogeking hasn't been with us the whole time, and then there's that moment where Sanji is reassuring him that Sogeking is an invincible hero, so he should be fine. All of that is added in the anime, but I actually really enjoyed that scene, so kudos to them. And we actually get to see an imagining of the disguise that Usopp envisions in his head. And it's actually based on the horrible disguises that Foxy uses during the Davy Back fight to trick Luffy, with those big exaggerated head and that sort of caricature looking face painted on those big bubble heads. And then throughout most of the conversation with Oimo about Dory and Broggy and Little Garden, a lot of the scenes that took place during that moment, as well as the flashback to Dory and Broggy's backstory, those have all been reanimated and reinserted here in the 16:9 HD format. And so, yeah, I actually enjoyed revisiting those, even though obviously it's filler. But yeah, it's nice to see. It's nice to see that it is reanimated. All right, so let's get into the episodes themselves. So this whole beginning portion of episode 268 is, of course, filler, picking up from the last episode's cliffhanger. There is one interesting thing that Luffy mentions as he's cornered. He's almost forced to use his new technique, as he mentions, I guess I'll have to try it out here, but gets interrupted by cannon fire. This scene is pretty funny, though, because it is stupid with Luffy avoiding getting his hand stepped on. And then eventually all the Marines accidentally break the cliff and fall. And the funnest thing about this is how well organized they're all hanging in sort of this neat checkered pattern. I don't know, that image is just really funny to me. Anyways, the real episode starts after the opening, where we catch up with the Straw Hats just after disembarking the crashed Rocket Man. And there's this hilarious exchange with Zoro and Sanji where Sanji mocks Zoro for being called Luffy's underling by the Marines. But then Zoro has this quick comeback where they at least know who he is. So Zoro mentions how Sanji must be even lower than that and starts referring to him as Pirate A or Pirate B and C, which obviously gets under his skin. And that's such a genius comeback. And the fact that he keeps going with that little bit makes that scene even funnier. The laughs don't stop there as the Marines fire upon the Rocket Man. Usopp gets knocked over with his Sogeking mask being knocked off. But before Chopper can actually see his face, he does this sort of triple roll to get his mask back on. And then Kokoro and Chimney and Gombe are all acting like hostages as distraction while Nami gets to test out her new perfect climb attack weapon with the new and improved Thunderbolt tempo, which we see has some insane power to the point where even Nami is shocked, pun intended, by the power and range and has to flee her own attack. And on her way, she smacks Sogeking on the head, which prompts Chopper to ask why Nami is hitting Sogeking when he has nothing to do with making the weapon. And Sogeking saying that Usopp doesn't remember putting in a feature like that, calling back to how Usopp doesn't even quite understand what he's building when it comes to Nami's weapon, like back in Arabasta. And it's it's pretty funny callback to that Usopp keeps making these features in the climb attack that he intends a certain way, yet Nami keeps finding new ways to use it. And I do like what this joke means, though, in sort of an underlying way. I mean, this means that while Usopp is giving Nami the tools, it really is Nami herself and her strength and intelligence that is actually where the power is coming from. Saying that this weapon in the hands of anyone else would virtually only be useful as a party trick tool, as Usopp kind of intended it, meaning that Nami is the source of the strength and power and not just, it's not something that's just handed to her. This also gets to showcase to everyone around with the Frankie family mistaking Nami as just a support, but they come to realize that she is actually just as capable of a combatant as everyone else, which is a very awesome moment. However, when we do see the aftermath of it, we see that the attack was indeed indiscriminate as it fried Zoro and Sanji as well, with Nami telling Sogeking to apologize to them, with him barking back, "You apologize, idiot!" And it's moments like this that bring a smile back to us, at least to me, that Usopp at least is back with them, and it seems like they're a crew and shows us just the dynamic, and it just doesn't work without Usopp. Like, Usopp is an integral part in terms of just how we view them as a unit. And just then, the Straw Hats eventually get surrounded by that watchdog unit, while Polly shows up with Sodom to help them aboard so they don't waste their time on the small fry. And one thing that's weird about this scene is that while the gist of the events that take place here are correct, the way this scene is directed in the anime is kind of off. It's weird. And I'll tell you what I mean by this. So in the manga, the events play out that Polly shows up with Sodom, yelling down to them to get aboard, and then emphatically yells the speech that he gives in the anime at them about not forgetting what their real objective was and that this isn't the place for them to go wild, then extends the ropes down to them. However, in the anime, he extends the rope down first, then gives the speech once they're all aboard, but he says the speech in a really subdued and almost calm manner with his back to them. It's a small change, but it kind of robs Polly of like a really small, cool moment for him. He still does get that cool moment just before leaping back down to fight alongside Lulu and Tilestone, where he tells Zoro if he sees them, meaning Lucci, Kaku, and Khalifa, to tell them that they're all fired. And I thought that was a really badass moment for Polly, and I always really like that moment. However, what's not badass is Oda's fake out and lack of consequences for things he does. Mainly in the last episode, he makes this dramatic show of how Polly is wounded pretty badly by getting stabbed in the shoulder, all the way through the shoulder, but now he's basically fighting like nothing happened, like no decreased strength and mobility or stamina. He's just totally fine. I don't necessarily want any of the characters out of action, but anytime Oda does this, it just feels really cheap, and by now it's just kind of tired because I know nothing's going to come of this, especially for me who's seen him do this for more than 1,000 episodes by now, with very little consequence for this generally. He does get a little bit better as the story progresses, but I mean, it's still pretty egregious. But yeah, anytime something like this happens, it always bothers me. Like, I get he's trying to increase sort of the dramatic effect, but at the same time, I'd rather just not have him do that, or at least show some visible sign of struggle after they get wounded like that. Back in the Tower of Justice, we learn a little bit more about Spandam and his plans, and a bit more about Iceberg and how he was able to protect himself and the city of Water 7 by taking on government contracts. Something Frankie never could understand why Iceberg would ever help the group that led to the death of their master and supposed death of his apprentice brother, meaning himself, Frankie. showing that Iceberg was not only a brilliant man, but an incredibly self sacrificing one, swallowing all that grudge and resentment towards the world government to do what was right to protect Water 7. And on the opposite spectrum, we're about to see just how despicable of a man Spandam really is, as he's just drunk on all this power that he's got without really earning any of it. And Oda is so damn good once again at making such a hateable villain. I mean, because I freaking hate Spandam with a passion. He is the worst kind of villain, as he doesn't even have any real power himself. He's literally just a poser who lucked into it and is so insecure about it that he will use it to denigrate anyone and everyone just to prove his quote unquote power over people. And I think Spandam works so well because we all know people like this to a certain extent. Maybe not quite to this degree, but those who essentially posture at being influential or powerful because they don't actually command real respect or leadership, so they use what little status and power they have to put others down just to elevate themselves up. And we all know people like that. And it's irritating to no end, and Spandam is just a more exaggerated and violent version of that. But if that wasn't enough to hate him, he goes back on his promise with Robin to let the Straw Hats go on a technicality. Of course, Masaya Onosaka, his acting elevates that even more as he brings that pompous and annoying quality out even more with his portrayal of Spandam in the anime. It's hard to believe that this is the same guy that plays sort of a benevolent hero like Vash the Stampede, or that lovable tennis player, Momoshiro Takeshi from Prince of Tennis. It's just really hard to see that, but yeah, he has quite some range. However, it's kind of nice to see that the rest of the CP9 don't really share Spandam's ideology and don't necessarily agree or like, with, that Spandam. As Lucci explains in a pretty chilling moment, I don't necessarily hate any of the CP9 agents, which is why having Spandam is so important, as he is the real villain. Even though Lucci is seen as the ultimate obstacle, we need someone to really hate. While Lucci is not likable or anything, he's ultimately just a tool for the world government, and he even says as much, that he only follows someone like Spandam because of the world government, and they deem him to have power to do so, which makes sense. I mean, he's all business. And I mean, we all know if Spandam wasn't granted that power by the Gorosei, Lucci would probably kill a man like Spandam. However, when pressed by Spandam, what Lucci is ultimately after and what his motivations for doing this sort of line of work, if not for the power and authority, he just coldly and creepily says that this is the one job that allows him to quench his thirst for blood. Like, Jesus, that is chilling. And he does this as he transforms into his hybrid leopard form, which makes it even more chilling. Lucci by nature is a pretty vicious and sadistic man, but as noted on Water 7, the fact that he has a carnivorous zone devil fruit just further enhances that bloodlust. However, to me, the fact that he has that much respect for the law kind of shows me that at least he has a bit more honor and is more honorable than Spandam. While Lucci is willing to do a lot of terrible things, there are limits, and he does seem to have a code of some sort, which does add sort of a added dimension to Lucci, other than just being, an enforcer type with just point me at somebody and I'll kill them type of personality. One other thing to note about this scene is how Blueno seems a bit more concerned about the report that the Straw Hats had arrived on Enies Lobby and sort of the lack of casualties, and even notices that the receiver on the Denden Mushi has been left unhooked, realizing that there's probably more of a threat than Spandam had originally been led to think, which we'll see come to play in the very near future. When we go back to see how the Straw Hats are doing, they're making pretty good progress as Chopper converses with Sodom about how they came to be part of the Frankie family. But the kicker is that Sodom asks them what happened to the long-nosed guy, as he hasn't been with them since the beginning. And it's here that they, and I think pretty much most of us realize that Sogeking hasn't been with them this whole time. At least I remember I completely forgot that he wasn't with them. And in fact, even though I've seen this entire run multiple times, at least a dozen times through, I again completely forgot that Sogeking is not with them. And yeah, that kind of made me chuckle, actually, how the storytelling always makes me forget about Sogeking. But most everyone is obviously freaking out over King. But Zoro actually kind of coldly says that they can't go back for him at this point, with Nami pointing out that it's not like he's Luffy. He's gonna die if he's left alone on an island full of enemy soldiers. But Zoro again commands like this epic moment where he turns on his sort of vice captain hat, and it's turned on his head. His initial seemingly cold comment about not going back for him was more out of trust than sort of disregard. He explains that throughout their journey and throughout every, life and death situation, Usopp, just like every one of them, has survived and have come out stronger for it. And Usopp is no exception. And Zoro trusts and believes in Usopp. And this is another great moment that adds to the subplot of Usopp feeling inadequate and him leaving earlier in the arc, as one of the biggest fears was him being left behind due to his supposed weakness. But this just reinforces the idea that no one in the crew thinks that of Usopp, and this is coming from Zoro. And it makes it that much more impactful because, he is the only one that would never even attempt to bullshit about something like that, and he will tell it like it is, unlike the others maybe would say something just to make Usopp feel better. But Zoro, this is the one guy who would never sugarcoat anything and will actually tell the truth. So it's pretty huge that it's coming from Zoro. And then in the next scene, we kind of get, like I mentioned, it's in the differences section, this is a filler, but I do really like the nice added touch of upon hearing this, Chopper freaks out because he has no idea what Zoro is talking about since they only just met King, and how could he know this? And Sanji, being the ever kind and compassionate person, not only preserves Usopp's dignity and disguise, he explains it to Chopper in a way that makes sense to him and reassures him that since King is an invincible hero, he'll be fine. And it's such an awesome addition that informs both, all the characters and their sort of personalities, but also kind of fills in a minor missing story beat. And I love this entire added scene, and kudos to Toei for adding this in. I almost feel like this is something that after the fact that Oda asked them to include because it's such a well-written and well-realized scene. But now we're going to get to some of the good parts. So as an almost immediate payoff to Blueno noticing something was off, when Luffy finally arrives at the gate just before the Tower of Justice, Blueno appears before him through his air door, and holy crap, already Luffy is going to have to face a CP9 agent by himself. And this moment was exciting as we'd finally get to see how Luffy would fare against Blueno this time, now that he's fully focused after getting his ass handed to him earlier in the Galley of the Company mansion. And, see how he would compare, as he seemed fully confident throughout the train ride that he's got new techniques and new strategies to combat the CP9. And like I mentioned last episode when I predicted who would fight who, I expected Blueno to face Frankie, so I was taken by complete surprise how early this fight against a prominent CP9 agent was. But, obviously I was all for it. To see Luffy beat the shit out of Blueno would be so satisfying. However, there is one piece of criticism about this scene I have to point out. It's another really bad directing decision in my opinion, which is the shot of Luffy and Blueno staring down each other. It's shot all wrong, especially when you consider how it's depicted in the manga. So the scene is showing roughly the same thing. It's the same shot. It's just a shot of the two of them staring each other down for the first time and getting ready to battle each other. But sort of the artistic intent and connotation of what Oda was trying to convey is just completely lost in the anime. Also, you can't even really see anything as the pair aren't even ever really on screen at the same time. Like the perspective is completely off and they're both like cut off because the camera has to move. But what I mean by this is, so in the manga, this moment is just one, half-page panel of them both in frame, staring each other down, standing much closer together, with Blueno in the center of the panel, looking far bigger and more imposing, towering over Luffy, who is smaller naturally anyways, but he's made to look even smaller by putting him in the bottom right corner from a down low angle perspective, conveying to us, the viewer/reader, just how much of an imposing force Blueno is compared to Luffy. And this is something that Oda does all the time. And it's actually a really cool panel that's completely lost most of its meaning in the anime with the way they decided to animate it. Luckily, this scene is already so awesome, it's not hurt too badly by this, as the last exchange of dialogue is so freaking cool, with Blueno rhetorically asking, "How long do you intend on going wild?" And Luffy just excitedly responds, "Until I die," which fits his character so well and how he lives his white life. I mean, that line is so damn cool. Now, following up on the earlier reveal that Usopp was left behind, we learn that he's been hiding in the hair of Oimo and trying to figure out a way to safely regroup with the others. And I love how his initial plan was to disguise himself. And I really love how in the anime we get to see what he envisions, and it's essentially the same type of god awful disguise as what Foxy was using during the Davy Bag fight. He just dresses himself up as a government agent with that big round bulbous head with the ugly makeup. And after this, though, we get a really amazing and pretty emotional scene where Oimo is distraught and crying, mentioning how he shamed Elbaf, which obviously catches Usopp and our attention immediately as our ears perk up. And this is the first mention of Elbaf in a long time. And it makes sense that these two giants are from the home of the giants Elbaf that we learned on Little Garden. But what's even crazier is that we learned both of them in fact served under the Dory and Bragi, the same pirate giants that we met on Little Garden. And we get a retelling of Dory and Bragi's flashback to remind some of the audience, since it has been quite a while since we've seen this story, over 200 episodes ago, and in fact almost 6 years in real time, if you're watching at that time. And it turns out that both Oimo and Kashi were part of the crew that was forced to leave Dory and Bragi on Little Garden to settle their duel. But after not returning for such a long time, they both set out to retrieve them, but instead get captured by Marines, only to be fed a lie that Dory and Bragi were in fact captured as well, but gave them a deal that if they worked for 100 years that they would let all of them free. And this revolution was mind-blowing at the time, to me at least, because this is, I think, one of the first times in the series where this sort of long form twist reveals occurs, where years in real time would pass before Oda would come back to tie something back in the present in some shocking or unexpected way. And this was one of those huge moments for me that really cemented that this series and Oda was sort of headed on a legendary path. I mean, obviously I loved One Piece at this point still, and I thought it was probably it was the best series I'd ever seen, but this sort of way of storytelling was something I had never ever experienced anything like this from a story. And that shocking feeling of tying something you yourself had long forgotten about or didn't even consider to be significant to begin with, and have it come up and play a massive role in the story years down the line is just crazy. And beyond the storytelling and shock factor of this technique that Oda employs, it does one other thing that I think really cements in the reader and viewer's mind, as well as a fan. It's sort of a reward for those of us that stick with the story and, being so invested in it. And for me personally, it creates this really personal attachment and investment to the story itself, as if Oda is rewarding those of us who have paid attention and gotten really into his world and story and remember all the small details. It's really amazing and almost euphoric when these moments occur throughout the story. And I think this is really the first example of this, but certainly not the last by a long shot. Usopp, hearing this story, is clearly confused because he just met Dory and Bragi a few months or weeks earlier. I'm not entirely sure how much time has passed, but Usopp knows they're just fine and still dueling on Little Garden for all he knows. But it takes some effort for him to convince Oimo of this fact, even going so far as to imitate their very distinct laugh styles, the ga ba 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 ba, ge 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 ge. And I do like the added detail that Usopp's insides are all still messed up from being beaten within an inch of his life about 4 times now in the last few days, so he struggles and coughs a bit every time he does one of those laughs. It's a nice added detail. And yeah, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but one thing that I love this moment does is, again, it is yet another moment that Oda has given us to reinforce the idea that Usopp is not weak or useless. His passion and dedication to being a brave warrior of the sea and his admiration for the culture of Elbaf and the giants is what gets through to Oimo, ultimately helping him befriend them, both Oimo and Kashi. And it's Usopp's unique passion, sincerity, and relatability again that allows Usopp to draw people in, much like Luffy, but also in a very distinctly different way. And we will see this in the next few episodes, how huge this will be. And that was, again, another pun intended. But yeah, it's interesting. Like I mean, I noticed some of these things when I originally read through and watched the Enies Lobby and Water 7 arc, but now that I've sort of like am really hyper aware and paying attention for this podcast, I it's kind of amazing to see how many times Oda actually goes out of his way to show Usopp being this sort of um major force in sort of progressing the story and sort of being useful, being a pivotal, pivotal character. Obviously, he's going to get even more moments later on that, obviously if you've seen further on, you know which scenes I'm talking about. But even just up leading up to this, he still has all these small moments of showing how important Usopp actually is to the crew. And that's just something I even failed to notice, upon my several rewatches or my original viewing of all of this. So it's even kind of cool for me to go back and see all these examples of Usopp being awesome. Jumping back to the main group, Sodom is shot with an artillery cannon mortar and is heavily wounded. And this is a pretty horrific moment as Sodom is bleeding like crazy and spitting up blood everywhere, but is doing his very best to stay up long enough for everyone to transfer to Gamora. And despite not having too much screen time or much dialogue, you feel really bad for Sodom, and it's a pretty emotional scene seeing them have to abandon and leave Sodom behind like this. But of course, this is One Piece. We know he's going to be fine somehow and alive. How, whatever. Even though he's just like buried under like a bunch of enemy soldiers. Anyways, with by now that I'm pretty salty about whenever that happens. That is my one gripe with Oda in terms of his storytelling. But with the final few minutes of the episode, we finally get back to what we've all been wanting to see since the reveal at the end of episode 269. What is going to happen with Blueno and Luffy? Blueno, by extension, is Oda reinforcing to Luffy and us exactly what the stakes are now that Luffy has entered Enies Lobby and has attacked the world government, which are huge in terms of the target that Luffy has now put on his back as well as the crew. And Blueno then takes a pot shot at Luffy, saying how they stand no chance since they got their asses beat down at the Galila mansion. But Luffy, the ever-confident optimist, just comes right back and says this time he just doesn't feel like he's gonna lose. Which I wish I had that kind of confidence. Like, I mean, I've always wanted to live my life more like Luffy in terms of just his happy-go-lucky, confident feel, but that is just a whole nother level in terms of confidence. But yeah, and now we get to see him ready his Gomu Gomu no rifle, and yeah, like, what a comeback. But Blueno, overconfident in his own Tekkai, decides to take the full brunt of Luffy's Gomu Gomu no rifle, and it finally breaks through the Tekkai for the first time. Blueno actually draws blood. And this has been a steady buildup of ever-escalating breakdown of Blueno's Tekkai, with Frankie and Sanji affecting it little by little. But we finally get the payoff to that, with Luffy finally breaking through. But if that wasn't enough, it looks like Luffy can now keep up with the speed of Soru as well. And so not only has he now seen through and broken through two of the Rokushiki techniques, I mean, it's now looking like, yeah, Luffy does in fact have the ability to face the CP9. And yeah, by the end of the episode, Luffy makes it clear he doesn't care about any of the wider implications in terms of the politics or anything like that. He's just there to do one simple thing, and that's to get Robin back. And what a way to end an episode. Like, in a series of episodes where it has been nonstop action, this is where things are really starting to heat up, as they're now starting to get past the cannon fodder and getting into the juicier parts. However, we'll have to wait till the next podcast and the next several episodes. But yeah, we're just getting started. I mean, I can't tell you how much more awesome Enies Lobby gets from here. But anyways, if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram and Twitter account at SunnyGo Podcast if you want updates when I post new episodes. Or if you'd like to support me, you can find my support link on the website. Um, Anything is appreciated. And yeah, I think I'll mention a couple small spoiler things, but not really too much in detail. But yeah, as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to listen to my podcast. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye. So just a really mini spoiler section. The only thing I kind of wanted to mention is sort of that conversation with Lucci and Spandam, and how I mentioned how if it weren't for the power that was granted to Spandam, that Lucci would probably kill him. We do in fact find out later on, obviously in the CP9 cover story, much later on down the line, is that a lot of that is focused on Lucci being pissed that Spandam betrayed them after his defeat to Luffy. And essentially, that cover story goes around covering Lucci's attempt to kill Spandam for betraying him, essentially. But yeah, it's interesting to see how that cover story plays out. I'm not really going to discuss the cover story here, obviously, because it's going to get its own podcast episode when we get to that point. But yeah, there's again, that's just kind of the only thing I kind of wanted to mention because I always found that really interesting. Just seeing why Lucci, a guy like Lucci, would ever follow anyone like Spandam. But again, Lucci does have his sort of own set of codes. He's a shit person, but at the same time, he's not necessarily he's not evil. I would say he's like bloodthirsty. Like he's just a very sadistic person, but it seems to always be directed in a direction for mostly good. I don't know. It's hard to describe Lucci. Lucci is a very complicated character, which is one of the reasons why he's so beloved as a villain. I think a lot of people really like Lucci, and it's also interesting to see him kind of folded back into the main story now that he's with the CP0. And yeah, it's really interesting to see what Oda will do with Lucci in the future because he's on Wano right now, or he's not on Wano, but he's near Wano right now. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see what kind of role he'll play because clearly Lucci is strong. So who knows if he's going to remain an antagonist towards the Straw Hats or if he's going to be more of one of those villains that come back as an ally. But yeah, anyways, that's just kind of neither here nor there. I just wanted to talk about that. But yeah, we'll bring this episode to a close and I'll see you next time. See ya.